you don't exist. Take a perk and a talk of that shit. Money swallowed like sis. Did it perfect in the kid. Got a billion who sang on my head. Look up better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million. The devil that shit ain't not cheap again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the third part of What If Deku Enters Godzilla Verse. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of GFan97 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. They'd planned to attack the Kamakura's nest that very night. Unfortunately, a nearby typhoon changed directions and was projected to hit the island at that time, forcing them to delay their plans. Sakaki didn't attack anyone this time, but still looked about as cheerful as Kaken when someone told him Shoto was the better hero. If that wasn't bad enough, just as they were finalizing their plans, Battlefist walked into the room with Lizardy, Chargebolt, Alien Queen, and the local hero Splash and Go, who'd missed the fighting while investigating with an attack on a local fishing boat the night prior, probably due to Kamakura's. Battlefist looked amongst them. "Excuse me, I'd like to speak to the officer in charge." "That would be me," said Sakaki. "What do you want?" Battlefist nodded, then said, "We heard you're planning an attack on the Mantis' nest. We wanted to offer our assistance." "You can do that by keeping watch over the town," said Sakaki. "As you probably noticed earlier today, you're no match for the Kamakuras. First off, Chargebolt successfully chased off one, so he can help against those," said Battlefist. "As for the rest of us, while we're not suited for the bigger ones, we can help you against the smaller ones. They're not much stronger than a typical villain, and we have experience doing joint operations with the police, so we know how to cooperate." Izuku resisted the temptation to point out that in said operations, the police rarely did any fighting and usually focused on crowd control and maintaining a perimeter, which would be very different from working with the AMF infantry trained to search and destroy. Sakaki turned to Colonel Gondo. Did he wear those sunglasses inside because he was trying to look cool? Did he just like wearing them? "Gondo, your opinion?" Gondo shrugged. "We should have killed most of the runts in the last battle and have plenty of ammo left over. We'll be fine." Sakaki nodded. "Very well then." He turned to Battlefist. "We're grateful for your offer, but the answer is no." Battlefist's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. "Are you sure about that?" said Lizardy. "Most of you don't even use your quirks, so wouldn't ours be a useful boost?" And like that, all semblance of cordiality from the assembled G-Force members vanished. A fun fact about the AMF was that a disproportionate number of them had weak, heteromorphic, or no quirks at all. They were outcasts, people who'd come here for a place where they could be believed in, where their quirks no longer mattered. A place where someone with no quirk like Izuku could be on par with someone like Ochako. So, needless to say, Lizardy's remark struck a very raw nerve and, within moments, everyone in the room was giving her a death glare. To her credit, Lizardy seemed to instantly realize she'd made a mistake saying, "Sorry about that. Forget I said anything." "As I was saying," said Sakaki, "we are perfectly capable of handling the Kamakuras ourselves. Thank you for your offer." That last part couldn't have sounded less sincere if he'd tried. Battlefist held his gaze for a very long moment. "Very well." She turned to her companions. "Let's go, guys." She and the others walked out. Izuku felt his shoulders sag. Usually, heroes sticking their noses where they don't belong was a good thing, an example of nobility and virtue. But did they really have to do that against kaiju? Izuku would vastly prefer if they left the kaiju fighting to the kaiju hunters like him. It wasn't like they ever let the AMF fight villains after all. As for Lizardy, logically Izuku knew he shouldn't blame her for that insensitive remark. In her experience, powered opponents were left to the heroes and their quirks while the police acted as support. She wasn't trying to demean the AMF, she was just used to a very different sort of combat doctrine. But that didn't change the fact that her comment burned. After everything he'd done, everything he'd faced, Izuku had long since proven his lack of natural power did not have to mean weakness. With the right tools, training, and skills, Izuku had overcome monsters far beyond the villains everyone said were too dangerous for him. hearing it suggested otherwise, even accidentally, felt deeply insulting. Izuku wondered, not for the first time, if kaiju were more well-known, would someone like him still be allowed to fight? Or would others, people who didn't realize how pointless quirks were compared to the power of kaiju like Godzilla and weapons like the masers, decide it was too dangerous for someone like him and force him onto the sidelines? Izuku pushed such thoughts out. It didn't matter. The heroes weren't joining this hunt. G-Force was doing it themselves. After the meeting concluded, Izuku changed into his casual clothes, along with a Uraraka hoodie which had the phrase "sweatshirt" written on the front. Izuku briefly wondered if Ochako had been inspired to make this particular line of sweatshirts by his shirts that said T-shirt. Nah, plenty of brands declared what article of clothing they were on the front, right? After that, Izuku joined his maser team for a trip to the beach. They were on visiting a beautiful island during warm weather after all. Why not enjoy it while it lasts? While there, Izuku alternating between walking in the surf and joining in his teammates' antics. At one point, he distracted Akiba so Kisaragi could dunk him. Akiba never suspected a thing. Unfortunately, Hayama used the distraction to splash them all, using his minor wind quirk to bolster his attacks. They got their revenge on him soon after. Later they wandered into town. While walking, Izuku caught sight of an old mural, depicting a familiar charcoal gray sea monster attacking the island. Izuku took a picture while grinning. "Looks like they still didn't forget you here, did they, big guy?" He was about to put his phone away when it dinged. Ochako, about to do that charity function for kids facing quirk discrimination. "Wish me luck." Izuku smiled and typed out. "Me, good luck Ochako, they'll love you. Midoriya." Izuku turned at the voice of his teammates. Yashiro and Zeni walked over. Zeni said, "We just heard that they're going to be putting on an old ritual at a shrine near the beach. Thought that you might be interested in it." "Really? Why?" said Izuku. "It's the one they used to use hundreds of years ago to try and exorcise Godzilla," said Yashiro. Izuku gasped. "The Godzilla exorcism ritual?" Izuku had read about it, even watched videos of it, but he'd never seen it in person. Izuku heard a high-pitched squealing that it took him a few moments to realize was himself. He was going to this ceremony. Nothing would stop him. "Fanboy," said Hayama. Izuku ignored him. "When is it?" "Half an hour." "We're going now," Izuku said with the same level of authority he usually reserved for giving orders. The others rolled their eyes and followed. A half-hour later, they were sitting together watching the ritual. It didn't disappoint. The dancers swayed in tandem to the drums and gongs. Their moves were methodical and graceful, which combined with their ceremonial garb to give them an almost otherworldly feel. Izuku took notes on the dance. It was almost identical to the archival videos he'd seen, with the few irregularities he did catch likely due to either the passage of time or the level of experience among the dancers. As it continued, Izuku heard an old man behind him talking. This was an exorcism ritual of the monster they say lived here long ago. They called it Godzilla. "Godzilla?" said, "Was that alien queen?" Izuku turned around and sure enough, several heroes were watching the show behind him with an old man and All Might. Izuku ignored the last one and focused on the others. He saw Alien Queen, Chargebolt, Tail Man, and Invisible Girl. "The name sounds familiar," said Chargebolt. "I think I read it in some stuff from the dawn of quirks." "The legend existed on this island for centuries before that," the old man said. "It is said that in those days, when our island was still called Odo, when fishing was bad they'd send out girls as a sacrifice to keep the monster from devouring us all. This exorcism ritual is all that's left of the old ways." "Glad I'm visiting now and not then," said Earphone Jack. "Yeah, he'd probably eat you in one bite," said Chargebolt. "Shut up," she said, elbowing him. He laughed and put his arm around her. "It's nice your people still pass down this ritual, Mr. Fujimoto," said All Might. "Tradition can be a valuable thing. It's good to keep in touch with it." "Thank you, Yagi," said the old man. "Why would you need the sacrifice thing if you have the exorcism dance?" said Invisible Girl. "Because the exorcism dance has a precedent for failing," Izuku said, unable to contain himself. Quite spectacularly in some instances. The old man, Mr. Fujimoto, turned to Izuku an annoyed glare. "What do you know about it, boy?" "Tons," said Izuku. the dam on his fanboy level of knowledge bursting. This is my first time seeing it in person, but I have studied a lot about it. For instance, in 1954 this was the last of the island's Godzilla traditions and, according to reports by a reporter named Hajiwara, they performed it the very same night he came ashore. Mr. Fujimoto looked at him with curiosity. You have done your research? Izuku nodded. Of course. How big was this monster? Said Alien Queen to Mr. Fujimoto. Very large, Mr. Fujimoto said. At least the size of rather tall building, he said. 50 meters, said Izuku, while Hayama muttered, feels a lot bigger sometimes. Fujimoto stared at them before realization flashed behind his eyes. You're all? He gestured at the AMF ships anchored off the shore. Izuku smiled and nodded. That's right. Mr. Fujimoto's looked amazed. Then you've actually seen. Oh yeah, said Zenny. Izuku here more than anyone else. Mr. Fujimoto leaned forward. What's he like? The most terrifying and magnificent thing I've ever seen, said Izuku. The sort of thing almost no one wants to see, but no one can forget once they have. I should point out Midoriya's insane, said Hayama. Most just consider him freaking terrifying. Then again, Midoriya's not exactly wrong. Seeing him is something you never forget. Fujimoto extended his hand. Daisuke Fujimoto, an honor to meet you. Izuku shook it. Izuku Midoriya. Pleased to meet you, Midoriya. Glad you could see our traditions firsthand. Likewise. After that, Izuku focused back on the ceremony. As it went on, he continued taking notes and even took some video on his phone. The show ended and the crowd began dispersing. Izuku got up and stretched. He was about to leave, but Chargebolt cut him off. Hey man, thanks for sharing that info, said Chargebolt with a friendly smile. You really seem to know your stuff. Yep, said Izuku. When it comes to Godzilla, I try to learn everything I can. It's a passion. Neat. 50 meters, that's like Ghidorah tall, right? Ghidorah was actually closer to 100 meters, said Izuku. Even by kaiju standards he was big. Cool. Denki Kaminari, by the way. Izuku Midoriya. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too, said Kaminari. You're with those army guys, right? AMF actually, said Izuku. There was a difference. Right, sorry, said Kaminari. Good job fighting those mantises, by the way. Couldn't have done it ourselves. Thanks, said Izuku. You didn't do a bad job yourself. Heard you even drove one off. Not that the AMF needed him to. Also, your colleagues were instrumental to keeping the civilian casualty rate so low, so thanks for that. And Izuku meant it. The civilian casualties would likely have been much higher without the hero's help. Thanks man, glad to hear that. Especially since a lot of your friends felt a bit differently. Izuku shuffled his feet. Yeah, sorry about that. A lot of them have issues with hero society. Don't get me wrong, I can understand where they're coming from, but in the end I can't help but love heroes. Kaminari had a mischievous glint in his eye. You do you? He wasn't going to try to... You want an autograph? Oh, he was. Sure, said Izuku. Can I have them from your friends too? He wasn't going to waste an opportunity like this. Sure. Kaminari took his notebook and signed it, then gave all of his friends for them to sign too. They would have passed it to All Might, but Izuku quickly said he already had his and took it back. Nearly half a dozen new autographs. Izuku basked in his victory, ignoring Kisaragi's comment on how shameless he was. By the way, said Kaminari, we'd like to help you guys fight the mantises, but your superiors don't like it. I don't suppose you could put in a good word for us? Izuku smiled, put a hand on Kaminari's shoulder, then said, Heck no. Kaminari's face was priceless. Izuku turned away, barely containing his laughter. His teammates didn't even try. This was the second time heroes had tried that in as many months. Nice talking with you, Kaminari, Izuku said, walking away. Thanks for the autographs. You too, said Kaminari. At least he was graceful in defeat. Come on, said Alien Queen. We gave you autographs. What about reciprocity? Says the person I have it on very good authority still hasn't paid her roommate back the 30,000 yen she borrowed, said Izuku. Hey, I'll get around to that when I remember. They laughed even harder. Please tell me someone got that on camera, said Akiba. Zenny held out his phone with a big grin. The entire thing. Akiba turned to Izuku. Midoriya, I take back every time I ever mocked you for being a fanboy behind your back. Gee, then you what? Izuku said. Nothing. Izuku let that go as the team walked back to camp in high spirits the whole way. Aw man, I was sure that would work, said Kaminari as Gyro patted his shoulder. Still, cool guy to talk to. Mina scratched her head. Yeah, but how'd he know about that money I borrowed from Ochako? She stared after the group. I think you might have been talking to a stalker, said Gyro. Yeah, said Mina. After all, not many ways you can learn that sort of thing legitimately, right? Ochako sneezed. Too bad too, Mina continued. I was gonna tell Ochako I finally found someone who likes her weird hoodies. You still can, said Toru. Just leave out the stalker bit. Good idea, said Mina. She turned to their former teacher. Hey All Might, All Might? All Might started at his name. You okay? Said Mina. Yes, just distracted is all. We should go, said Mina. Storm will be here soon. All Might nodded. Yes, you're right, let's go. Toshinori took one last look after the boy. For some reason, something in Toshinori had started when he saw him. He didn't know where from, but Toshinori knew he'd seen him before. As he followed after his students, Toshinori looked up at the sky. A storm was coming. Inside his Satsuma submarine, Kenpachiro dove to the target zone. This was supposed to have been a research mission. Now it was a recovery operation. There was a typhoon coming, so he had to be quick. He glanced at the sub's onboard Geiger counter. Trace radiation, but nothing dangerous. Kenpachiro picked up the radio. Satsuma approaching target. He steered around a rocky outcropping. There it was. The missing us nuclear submarine. The sub was laying on its side, seemingly been torn in half. Using the sub's lights, Kenpachiro examined the inside of the sub. The decks had been ripped apart, the metal blackened and scorched, in some parts even melted. It seems to have been an explosion, Kenpachiro said. What could have? A wave of dust and turbulence hit Kenpachiro's sub, tossing it through the water like a bath toy. Kenpachiro gripped the controls, gritting his teeth as he struggled to avoid a fatal crash. Then, as unexpected as it had come, the turbulence vanished. Kenpachiro looked around. What was that? The dust cleared. Something was swimming among the rocks. No. Its back had 3 rows of spines, all glowing a brilliant electric blue. Kenpachiro had seen them once before. While growing up in the Ogasawaras, it was a day he'd always tried to forget. The radio crackled. Ken, are you okay? What's that on the screen? Ken? Ken. It can't be, said Kenpachiro. It can't be happening. You can't be here. You can't be here. He kept repeating that even after the form had swum away, toward the island. Why do you always read that? Izuku looked up at Zenny. He was staring at Izuku with a puzzled look. Izuku shrugged. It describes Ota Murakami's exploits in his own words. What more reason do I need? Zenny sighed. Look, I get you're a fanboy of the guy, but why read the same book 20 times? Haven't you found everything you need already? Izuku stared at the book cover as memories started to swirl. He said, It's the reason I joined the AMF. Really? Said Zenny. Izuku nodded. Yeah, Murakami's story was, let's just say it was what I needed to hear. His first year in high school was nearly half over, and he'd barely even noticed. So far, he'd simply drifted, with few hopes and fewer dreams. He guessed he'd become a police officer like All Might said. It was a nice career and a worthy cause. But it just wasn't what he wanted. Then again, what did that matter? What he wanted was impossible. Despite Izuku's lack of enthusiasm, fear persisted. What if this failed too? He couldn't bear to face that hopelessness from when All Might crushed his dreams gave him a much-needed reality check a second time. Izuku checked forums with quirkless people like him, which were growing smaller and rarer. As he'd feared, several posters claimed there was a tendency for quirkless people to not be hired for physically demanding jobs. He couldn't be absolutely sure it was true. Reference pool was small, but he couldn't risk it. Izuku needed another career path, just in case. Izuku considered his options. Maybe he could become a salaryman like Dad. On the forums, one poster recommended the Anti-Megalosaurus Force AMF, saying it welcomed people looked down on for their quirks. Izuku had heard of the AMF, but only vaguely. They secured quirked animals and primarily operated in wilderness areas with few people and fewer heroes. They also had a tendency to clash with heroes over jurisdiction. Frankly, Izuku wondered why this organization hadn't had their work replaced by heroes yet. After all, with how strong villains were, how much more difficult could these animals be? Curious, Izuku opened their website. It was mostly what Izuku expected, talking about the virtues of joining, warning about the potential danger, etc. However, one detail stuck out. They openly welcomed those with weak quirks or no quirks. In fact, they seemed to advertise directly to them. Heck, the man considered the finest member in the organization's history was born in 1933, long before the first quirk was ever recorded. Izuku quickly searched the name. Oda Murakami. There wasn't much on him from credible sources, but Izuku did find a memoir he'd written, Godzilla, The Half-Century War. The next day, Izuku went to a used bookstore and bought a copy. He arrived home and started reading. It's been nearly 50 years now, and I still remember clear as day the first time I saw him. As Izuku read, he became more and more engrossed. A burning city. An unstoppable threat. Two men fighting against impossible odds and saving hundreds of lives. With each word, Izuku's heart beat with a vitality it hadn't known in a long time. Then finally, the first part of the book ended. That's where my half-century obsession with Godzilla would really start. I'd find myself in front of him again soon enough, but next time I'd have much bigger guns. Izuku put the book down. His heart pounded in his chest. There was something there, something that Izuku hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten it. But what was it? Where had he? A man carried dozens of civilians out of a blazing fire, laughing all the while, showing the world a bright smile as he announced that everything would be okay. Izuku remembered. This was what it felt like to dream again. Ochako took a deep breath. She could do this. This was part of her goals of being became a hero. It was the day of the charity event, where Ochako would meet kids who'd faced mistreatment for their quirks and make them happy. This was her first time doing this sort of thing, but she was determined to succeed. She entered the building and met with the organizers and several parents. It was cordial, if a bit tedious. Once that was finished, she went out to meet the kids. The moment they saw her, their eyes brightened. They quickly surrounded her, eager to learn everything about her hero life. Ochako smiled and told them what she could, but it was honestly hard to keep up. Still, the smiles on their faces made it all worth it. Ochako wasn't the only hero here. Also attending was one of Mina's old classmates, Hitoshi Shinso aka the underground hero Void. He was enduring. If you're a hero, then why have I never heard of you? One obnoxious, precocious child said. Void twitched. Because I'm underground. I avoid the media. That sounds lame. Whose dumb idea was it for you to come here? I don't know. Some idiot organizer, said Shinso, looking like he wanted to deck the kid. Probably saw me win the sports festival in my first year and... You won the sports festival? Another child said. How the heck did you do that? Made Dynamite walk off the stage after he cussed me out. There was a brief moment of silence. Then the kids mobbed him. You beat Dynamite? How? Why'd he walk off the stage? Was he scared? What's your quirk? Poor Void looked like he'd prefer facing actual villains right now. I brainwashed him. Which is my quirk? Ooh, said one girl who looked like a zombie or a goth. It was hard to tell. That sounds like a villain's quirk. So cool. Void twitched. Villainous quirk or not, I'm a hero. Even better, said the girl. She pumped her fist in the air and accidentally it across the room. Another girl with hazel hair tied in a ponytail said, If you became a hero with your villainous quirk, does that mean I can be with mine? What's your quirk? Said Void. The girl gave him an angelic smile. I can make people stop breathing till they drop. Don't be a one-trick pony. Find a school with an entrance exam that isn't robots, and you'll do fine, Void said. Unfortunately for Void, the children kept coming with each one warded off replaced by 3 more. Ochako could try to save him, but watching him squirm was funnier. Besides, she had a crowd of her own to deal with. After introducing herself to yet another child, Ochako looked up and noticed a boy watching her. He looked to be around 7 or 8 at the oldest, wore an Uravity hoodie, and had curly black hair that covered one eye. He stood at the edge of the group, watching her very intently. Ochako locked eyes with him. The boy's face flushed red, and he looked away. Before she could go over to him, but Ochako was distracted by dozen or so kids still asking for her attention. Soon she was so caught up in speaking with them that she forgot about the black-haired boy. After about a half hour, the adults arranged games for the children, giving the heroes a brief respite. Ochako leaned against a wall next to Void and wiped some sweat from her brow. Who knew children could be so exhausting? Shota sneezed. Damn allergies. They just wouldn't leave me alone, Shinso murmured, a haunted look in his eyes. Ochako snickered. You'll be fine? He gave her a skeptical look. If you say so. Hitoshi Shinso, by the way. Ochako nodded. Ochako Uraraka. Nice to meet you. Thanks. So, how'd they get you for this? Ochako shrugged. Volunteered. A friend of mine was quirkless and bullied for it when he was young. I wanted to help other kids going through that sort of thing. He nodded. That's a good motive. I mainly do this because my quirk was deemed villainous growing up. I figured kids like that would appreciate knowing people like them have made it. That's sweet, Ochako said. Thanks. It's good they have a hero like you here too, though. A bit of cheerfulness to contrast with, he motioned to himself, dark clothing, eye bags and all. You're not half bad with them, you know, Ochako said, folding her arms. Thanks, Shinso said. I'm just glad they haven't clawed me to death like the demented hellcats they are. Ochako snickered. It's not funny. That did not help his case. He watched Uravity and Void out of the corner of his eye. Logically, Void would be the safer one to ask. With his quirk, he'd understand. But Uravity was his favorite. Sure, she'd probably say no, but if she didn't, Void would be his backup. He'd ask Uravity first. The kids came back, and Shinso was again being crowded again. He looked like he was in his own personal hell, which Ochako would sympathize with if it wasn't so hilarious. Ochako also had to deal with a lot of kids. A surprising amount told her how much they loved her. Even to the point of being their favorite hero, she needed to do more patrols without heroses in the double and single digits. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Ochako noticed the black-haired boy from before. He was in a secluded corner of the room, staring at her while fidgeting. He started to walk towards her, but halfway through his gaze drifted to the people around Ochako, and all courage vanished. This repeated 3 separate times. After the 3rd time, Ochako took matters into her own hands. She left the group of kids surrounding her and walked over to the boy, who'd taken refuge in a secluded corner of the room. The boy stared at her, his body language displaying a mix of excitement and apprehension. Ochako leaned forward, trying to put herself closer to the boy's eye level, and smiled. Hi there, she said in a soft tone. What's your name, and are you doing here all alone? He put his hands in his pockets and looked down. Mikumo Akatani. Didn't like dealing with other people, so I came here. Why don't you like dealing with other people? Don't get along with them, he said. He shuffled his feet. I have a question for you. Ochako blinked. Oh, what is it? You're my favorite hero, you see, and I wanted to ask, is it possible? He squeezed his eyes shut and blurted, Can I become a hero when I don't have a quirk? Oh. Ooh. Izuku had told her of his days dreaming to be a hero. How said dreams shifted from optimism to desperation. How everyone around him, intentionally or not, ground his dreams down to dust. When Ochako heard these stories, she resolved to help kids like Izuku, to give them hope. Yet, none of those promises had prepared her for this moment. Mikumo seemed to sense her nervousness. He was now frozen, fists clenched and eyes down, waiting for the blow to fall. He expected her to give him the same answer he'd likely heard hundreds of times before. The answer anyone would give. Fortunately, Ochako wasn't anyone. Yes. Mikumo stiffened, then his eyes grew wide. He slowly looked up. What did you say? Ochako grinned at him. I said yes. You're not just saying it to make me feel better or something, right? Mikumo said, tears brimming. Why, you really mean it? Ochako shook her head. My best friend is quirkless. He fights giant monsters for a living. Trust me, if you get the right training, carry the right gear, maybe make some good friends who can help you, you can be a hero, Ochako said. She reached out to ruffle his hair. Before she could, the boy crashed into Ochako and hugged her, tears freely flowing. Thank you, thank you. Ochako hugged him back. You're welcome, Mikumo. Scarce. Outside, thunder boomed, the wind howled. A torrent of rain beat against the houses. It was another typhoon. Ren lay in his futon, trying to get some sleep. None came. Maybe it was the howling wind, maybe it was the thunder, or maybe it was something else. Ren started to nod off. However, before he could fall asleep, he jolted back up. The ground shook. Ren felt the floor around his futon. It shook again, and again, and again, as if someone was beating a drum the size of a house. Was it an earthquake? No, what kind of earthquake felt like this? The tremors became stronger. Ren heard something outside, a rhythmic pounding, occurring in perfect tandem with the tremors. Ren bolted up, put on his poncho and ran outside. Through the darkness and heavy rainfall, he could barely see a meter in front of him. Ren tried to blink the water out of his eyes as he trudged forward, the trail from his house now a small creek with water running against Ren's ankles. Ren crashed into something. He fearfully backed away, but when the lightning flashed he saw it was only his neighbor Yamamoto. Ren, what's going on? Said Yamamoto. I don't know, said Ren. Maybe. Lightning flashed, illuminating the village. Yamamoto let out a terrified shriek. Before Ren could ask what was wrong, Yamamoto was gone, sprinting toward the nearest home like a demon was chasing behind him. Ren ran after him, struggling to keep his balance in the typhoon. Hey, wait for me. What's wrong? What did you see? Ren slipped, his face splashing into the mud. He tried to get up, but the tremors became stronger, knocking him back to the ground. Blinking water out of his eyes, Ren saw the house that Yamamoto had just run into collapse. Yamamoto. Another tremor came, this one sending a wave of water splashing into Ren. Ren tried to blink water out of his eyes. He couldn't see anything. There was too much. Rain? For a brief moment, the rain had stopped. Ren sat absolutely still, too terrified to even breathe. A stream of water poured onto Ren's head. The rain restarted, followed by a blast of thunder accompanying the strongest tremor of them all. Ren was sent sprawling on his back. An unholy roar erupted above him. Ren curled into a ball and squeezed his eyes shut, his mind repeating a desperate prayer for mercy over and over again. Something long and heavy dragged across the ground. The next day Ren would be found, still huddling, his head less than 2 meters away from a giant footprint. Izuku stepped outside his tent into the rain. Sakaki was waiting. Did you hear that? Said Izuku. Yeah. Sakaki glared toward the mountain. I sure did. Itsuka sat in the car, reflecting on last night's events. During the typhoon, there'd been a massive attack on the far side of the island, leaving large swaths of the villages destroyed. None of the residents got a good look at what did it, but they maintained it was an animal. A really big animal. Itsuka, Setsuna, Gyro, and Splash and Go were driving over to investigate. Itsuka looked out the window as they passed through the aftermath of the Kamakura's attack, taking in the devastation. It looked like a tornado had swept through. No doubt, this had been a major attack, far worse than anything the islanders could have been prepared for. Several houses were destroyed. People died. And the AMF declared it a resounding victory, talking about how lucky we'd been, Itsuka thought as she looked at a house with 2 distinct burn holes through it. They drove up and around the mountain toward the nearest village. When they reached it, Setsuna sat up. What the... The AMF were already there, blocking the road. The heroes got out of the car and walked forward. One of the guards held up a hand. No one's allowed past this point. That includes you. We're here to perform search and rescue, said Itsuku glaring. You can't stop us. Actually, we can, said the other guard, a woman based on the voice. This is AMF business. Move on, heroes. Itsuka growled. She was starting to lose her patience. Splash and Go got in the guard's face. I'm the local hero of this island. I swore to help the people of this island, and they need it here. Now let us through. No, the guard said. This is our business. Besides, I really doubt you want to be walking around out here. Izuku tilted her head. What? A group of soldiers passed from behind. Hoods up, masks on. If you haven't taken your iodine, take it now. Keep your Gigers handy, and report any high readings. Don't touch anything with your bare hands and decontaminate when you get out. Izuku looked at the soldiers. All of them were wearing thick clothes covering every inch of skin, while what looked like gas masks protected their faces. They looked more like they were about to walk on the surface of another planet than around an island village. Something's wrong. Izuku looked past the roadblock, where AMF soldiers sifted through the wreckage. All of them were dressed in the same heavy gear with the same masks. Several pointed small handheld devices at the wreckage, which Izuku bet were sensors of some kind. Why were they treating about this place like a biohazard? Izuku looked through the trees, looking on another part of the village. She'd assumed last night was another Mantis attack, but those didn't look like Mantis footprints. I know the villagers of this island. I know the dangers of this island. You need my help. Izuku's turned back to the roadblock, where Splash and Go was still arguing with the soldiers. We have the dangers well in hand, the female soldier said. As if on cue, a loud squeal came from the shoreline. Izuku saw a giant white cuttlefish walk onto the beach, balancing on two oversized tentacles. Splash and Go braced himself sprint down there, but before he could take a single step, the cuttlefish was blasted by multiple flamethrowers and rockets. The cuttlefish fell back into the water and vanished beneath the waves. Ugh. I hate Jazora, said one of the guards. The other one nodded. Freaking pests. I've helped kill enough for one lifetime. Splash and Go stared after the cuttlefish. I've fought those things, he said. Not the strongest, but certainly not weak. And they treat it like a minor annoyance. Who are these guys? Kendo put a hand on his arm. Come on, we're getting nowhere here. We should go. As they walked to the car, Gyro shot the guards a suspicious look. Once inside, she said, as you were walking away, one of them mentioned something else in the water. The other said she hoped he didn't show up. Kendo nodded. There was an evacuation order this morning too. There's something they're not telling us, and I want to know what it is. Contentment. He'd enjoyed his walk. Satisfaction. He'd destroyed his opponent. Annoyance. One escaped. Resolve. He'd return and finish the job. Do you really want to back? Wouldn't the nice cool depths be better? Or the warmer southern islands? Awareness of the intruder. Kenji threw himself out of the kaiju's mind in the instant before the wave of pain hit him. He sat upright in his seat, panting heavily. Damn it! I can read him just fine, but every time I try to suggest something he notices me. Kenji shook his head as the adrenaline faded. They were nearing Scarus. From the helicopter, Kenji could see everything. The trail of footprints leading from the shore, their path through the nearby houses, and finally back to the sea. Godzilla come to the opposite side of the island from AMF's ships. That and the storm covered him, leading to him making landfall completely undetected. Kenji opened his tablet and checked the casualty reports. Not great, but not horrible either. Several dead, a few missing, and dozens injured. One survivor had avoided being stepped on by less than 2 meters. Kenji decided to see if he saw anything. If there was one good thing to come of this, they'd finally been authorized to evacuate the island, so hopefully there'd be fewer casualties next time he came ashore. Their ships had been ready since the AMF arrived, so now it was only a matter of moving the non-essential populace, or at least the ones closest to the shore off the island. However, that would take time, and based on Kenji's probe, time may not be something they had. The chopper landed. Kenji got out and walked toward the disaster area. He passed a command post, where locals were being ferried inside a row of plastic boxes the size of showers and doused in pink steam. Decontamination chambers, a lifesaver for the AMF. Kenji stepped inside a tent where the survivor was held. Unfortunately, the man was too hysterical to say anything. Kenji tried to use his psychic abilities, but all he saw was a cacophony of half-remembered images from the night before. Nothing useful for analysis. Kenji realized he'd get nothing out of the man and left. Kenji walked to where Godzilla had marched through the village, following his path. The damage had been severed, but he'd seen worse. Then again, he'd been to Australia and visited the ruins of Sydney so. From what he'd seen in the air, Godzilla had left the sea for what was, to him, a short walk. Damage on the ground correlated that. Distance and overall shape of the prints indicated a leisurely pace, no urgency or aggression. At least, that's how it started. 3/4 of the way through, things changed. Kenji would have to examine the site personally, but based on reports the walk got really ugly. Or enthusiastic, depending who you ask. Unfortunately, seeing for himself meant hiking halfway across the hillside to get there. Ugh, why does it have to be so far? He was almost there when he heard a voice behind him. Kenji. Kenji turned around and saw Izuku walking up to join him. Izuku, how are you? A bit late to the fight, aren't you? Izuku grinned. Don't worry, I'm sure there'll be plenty of fighting before this is over. What about you? Are you going to the battle site? Yeah, you? Of course, I want to see it for myself. That's great. Your analyses are always welcome here. Izuku gave him a deadpan stare. This isn't because you want me to do your work for you, is it? But working so hard, Kenji said. Besides, work smarter, not harder. Kenji leaned over and panted. Maybe he was out of shape. When he looked up, Izuku had already gotten meters ahead and reached the crest of the hill. You okay, Kenji? Why are you in such good shape? Kenji said as he trudged up to him. You drive a tank for a living. You realize we have fitness requirements, right? All the more reason to stay an analyst, said Kenji, reaching the top. He looked down and there it was. The burnt-out husk of a Kamakura's. Kenji whistled. I'd say it didn't go well for the bug. Nope, Izuku said. He pointed upwards. If we go to that ridge, we can get a better view. Kenji took a drone out of his backpack and launched it. Or you can do that. Kenji smirked. Smarter, not harder, Izuku. Looks like he burned it, Izuku said. Smashed it too. Maybe clawed it given those marks on the side. Kenji looked up from his tablet. Looks like it. Using the drone's camera, he examined the house-sized tracks from above. Based on the prints, I'd say Godzilla noticed them just before reaching here. He rushed over and they fought. But Kenji frowned. The footprints show the Kamakuras walking up to him, not charging. But Godzilla's foot slipped in the mud in a way that's consistent with him taking a charge. You can tell all of that from just the tracks, said Izuku. Forensics is part of the trade, my friend, Kenji said. I can't use you for everything after all. Fair. Izuku smiled, which faded to a more analytical look. One of the Kamakuras had its wings shot yesterday. The other was relatively unharmed. One could have charged him while the other walked up to attack with its claws. Kenji nodded. Yeah, that fits, he began typing notes. He threw off the non-injured one which landed there. He pointed toward a deep depression several hundred meters away. Then picked up the other and slammed it into the ground, judging by the crater multiple times. Then he burned it, said Izuku. Yeah, Kenji said. You sure you don't want to be an analyst? Yes, Kenji. Damn. I like having someone on par with me. Izuku raised an eyebrow. I'd drive you insane in a week. You know what? You're right. Your obsessiveness would be insufferable. Anyway, after that the surviving Kamakuras took off. Based on the scorch marks on that hill, Kenji pointed, I'd say Godzilla fired on it. Given that there's no corpse, he probably missed. As for that other scorch mark, maybe he fired at the nest. Seems reasonable, said Izuku. One way to know for sure. Kenji nodded and sent his drone to check both the Kamakura's corpse and the burnt hills. All had high levels of a unique radioactive particle generated within Godzilla's body. Confirmed, he opened fire, Kenji said. All of this is just a tentative extrapolation, of course. Of course, said Izuku in a knowing tone. Were you recording this on your tablet? Smarter, not harder. I can use the recording to remember small details my notes left out. Izuku nodded. Good. They donned their hoods and masks and went to one of the footprints. Technically, the radiation levels on Godzilla's skin were low enough that you could walk in his footprints all day with no side effects. The breath was what you really had to watch out for, but why take a chance? Kenji got into the muddy print and took soil samples, while Izuku used the Geiger counter. Kenji could hear its rapid crackling. Radiation's higher than normal, Izuku said. Makes sense, said Kenji. We've been feeding him scraps for years. That submarine's reactor would have really filled him. He collected his samples and climbed out. Izuku had a radio to his ear. I have to go, Izuku said. They spotted the surviving Kamakiras on the other side of the mountain. We're going to strategize, then attack tonight. He handed Kenji the Geiger counter. Good luck. You too. As Izuku walked off, Kenji returned to his work. He glanced up at the Kamakura's corpse, his eyes lingering on the deep grooves left by Godzilla's claws. Ochako got back from patrol. It had been fairly uneventful, with only a mugging or two. A larger fight had broken out nearby, but it was over before Ochako get there. Oh well, less paperwork for her, she supposed. Ochako took a shower, letting the warm water wash over her. After that, she went to her desk to finish her paperwork. Hatsum had emailed her that the special costume she'd ordered would be ready in a day or so, which was good, though she hoped she didn't need it. With that done, Ochako began making her way out, looking at the ground and thinking of what she'd make for dinner tonight. Aw man, there's a situation in Hokkaido and the commission wants me to deal with it personally. Why you, shitty hair? Ochako looked up and saw Red Riot and Dynamite in the hallway outside Nejire's office, talking. Over the last few days, the two had been visiting to help Nejire take over a case they'd worked previously, though they'd be done after today. At Dynamite's question, Red Riot put his hands in his pockets and shrugged. Apparently, there's a villain group causing trouble. 2 of them have strength quirks and a 3rd shoots blades, so my quirk's well suited to the job. Crap. You mean I gotta go to that stupid island alone? Don't worry, Mina and Kaminari are there. That's not better. Aw come on, you know you love 'em. Be sure to say hi for me. While Dynamite growled at his friend, Ochako squeezed past. Not for the first time, Ochako if Dynamite was the cruel Kaken Izuku had told her about, but shook her head to clear those thoughts, but just as she was exiting the building. Oi, round face. Ochako stopped. Turning around, she saw Dynamite glaring right at her. Ochako glared back. My name's Uraraka. Whatever. You got something to say to me? Ochako was taken back. No. Why? Every time I visit Raccoon Eyes, you're giving me death glares out of the corner of your eye. It's annoying. So, what's your deal? Ochako rolled her eyes. Right, like no one could ever dislike your winning personality. Dynamite snorted. Didn't say that. But that's not why you dislike me, is it? Ochako looked down. It was unfair of her to dislike him on a hunch. After all, it wasn't his personality that put her off. It was his potential connection to Midori. Sighing, Ochako met Dynamite's eyes and said, Izukumidoriya. His flinch said it all. Izuku sat on an abandoned park bench. They were to attack at nightfall, so he had a little bit of time for himself. He chose to spend it here, reading. Around him the park was eerily silent, the only noise being the rustling of the trees. The area had been evacuated, a fact the heroes took as cheerfully as a group of Australians in a border dispute with the Iken. Izuku pushed the thoughts away, focusing on his book. Back in Tokyo, I learned the hard way that Godzilla could never be stopped, but you could grab his attention if you annoyed him enough. Izuku smiled. Truer words had never been spoken. He was about to turn the page when he heard footsteps. Excuse me, young man? Izuku stiffened. He slowly looked up. All Might smiled down at him. Mind if I sit here? Round Face hadn't touched him, but Katsuki still felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Izukumidoriya, Deku. His former friend and former victim. Katsuki rarely thought about him anymore, yet whenever he did, he felt ashamed. When they were kids they'd been close friends, thick as thieves. They did everything together. Then Katsuki got his quirk and Izuku didn't. Katsuki was told his quirk made him amazing, that he was superior than everyone else. Logically, that made quirkless little Deku inferior. When Izuku refused to give up his dream of being a hero, to stop seeing Katsuki as an equal, Katsuki viewed it as an attack on his very self. He responded the way he always did, brutally and relentlessly. For 10 years, he bullied Izuku to break his dream. For 10 years, Izuku held firm. Finally, after telling Izuku the cruelest thing he'd said before or since, Katsuki succeeded. Izuku's eyes lost their desperate fire, leaving only ash. It was unnerving. Katsuki couldn't bring himself to speak to the nerd for the rest of the year. However, he always arrived at school early and left late to check the roof. Just in case. At UA, Katsuki felt the nerd's absence. He'd been an ever-present part of Katsuki's life for so long, it was weird for him to be gone. But he'd gone to a public high school, far away from Katsuki. Throughout that first year, as he met kids as strong as he was, Katsuki's self-image crumbled. Half-and-half's demonstration in the battle trial, Ibag's victory in the sports festival, Katsuki's failure in the exams, his kidnapping by the League, they all showed him how weak he was. He wasn't better than his classmates. In fact, in a lot of ways he was worse. His childhood memories turned bitter as it slowly dawned how he'd really been. By the time it sank all the way through, it was far too late for apologies. "So," Roundface said, "you're Kaken." "I am," Katsuki said. "How do you know the nerd?" Roundface shrugged. "We became friends after high school, served together in the AMF. AMF. Those assholes the heroes out in wilderness areas always complain about." Katsuki brushed the thought aside. "What did he tell you?" "Enough," she said. "You bullied him." "An understatement," Katsuki said. "I made his life a living hell. I refused to face my own weakness and made him pay for it." Saying it to himself was hard enough. Saying it out loud almost physically hurt. But it was the truth, and Katsuki refused to run from it. Her eyes narrowed. "Do you regret it?" Katsuki nodded. "I do." Roundface had a thoughtful expression. "Did you ever apologize?" Katsuki shook his head. "By the time I realized how horrible I'd been, it had been over a year since I'd spoken with him. It would just reopen old wounds. He doesn't deserve that." The fire in Roundface's eyes faded. She sighed. "You're probably right. But," she pointed a finger to his face, "if you two do ever speak again, at least consider it. He'd probably appreciate it." Katsuki nodded. "Noted." After a moment of hesitation, he said, "How is he?" Roundface looked surprised. "He's fine. He's in a job he loves and has purpose. He's happy now." "Good," Katsuki said. "Between his dream-crushing handicap and the shit I put him through, he deserves that much." Roundface gave Katsuki a disappointed look. "You still don't think he could have been a hero, do you?" "No," Katsuki said. "You need power to fight villains. Without it you die. Even with quirks that happens." Roundface folded her arms. "Plenty of other heroes have quirks that are useless in combat and do just fine. It would have been an uphill fight, but Midori's capable of more than you think. Much more." She turned and walked toward the door, then briefly stopped. "I won't hold it against you, though. Everyone underestimated him." She walked out. Dr. Mifune packed the last of his notes. Before putting away the last notebook, he gave one final look at the various pages of loose pencil scrawls, notes in the margins, mathematical equations, and some brief insights in another, neater set of handwriting. He shoved the book into his bag and stood up. It was nearly time. He stepped into the hallway, passing one of the guards they'd hired. The Meta Liberation Army had been kind enough to lend him and ex-guards from their own personnel, even providing one of their warehouses as a hideout, but Mifune and X had other plans. They discreetly moved their equipment to a property they'd procured ahead of time and hired an independent villain to stand guard. When the Emlei's plan went off the rails, they could do nothing to stop it. As Mifune walked toward the workroom, he pulled out his locket and opened it, peering at the picture within. "Sleep well, my dear. They will pay for what they did to us." "Doctor," X said. Mifune snapped the locket shut. X grinned. "I'm doing the last check. We should be able to start tonight." Mifune nodded. "Good." He stuffed the locket in his pocket and sat down to wait. Izuku sat dead still as All Might eased himself onto the bench. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak, he could barely think. He tried to go back reading, but the words became a blur. Memories danced through his mind, despite his best efforts to squash them. "You've always been my favorite hero." "Can I be a hero without a quirk?" "No, I should think not." His eyes started to water. Why? Why did this memory still hurt? He'd proven All Might wrong. He'd proven him wrong for 7 years. He'd killed Gargantuas. He'd killed Kamacuras. Heck, he'd faced the king of the monsters himself. He'd put his life on the line, survived, and saved who knows how many in the process. He'd done all the things All Might, no everyone said he couldn't do. So why did that memory still hurt? Young man, are you all right? Izuku's eyes snapped open. He turned to All Might before hastily looking away. Yeah, I'm fine. Have we met before? Izuku stared at the ground, careful to avoid looking his former hero in the eyes. Yes, but don't worry. You probably wouldn't remember. It can't be. Toshinori had written off the curly green hair as a coincidence, just his mind playing tricks. But the eyes, the freckles, nervous expression as he stared at the ground, Toshinori couldn't deny it anymore. It's you. The boy's eyes briefly darted to Toshi, but refused to meet his eyes. That day with the sludge villain. The rooftop, Toshinori said. The boy looked up. So you do remember. How could I not remember that? The boy looked away again. I mean, I get that I learned your secret and all, but nothing came of it and everyone found out a year later anyway. I guess figured you'd forget. That was what he thought Toshinori would find notable? That the boy discovered his scrawny form? Not the way he'd cruelly snuffed out the boy's hope? The way he'd dismissed his pain? Did he really think Toshinori could do that and just treat it like another Tuesday? Young man, Toshinori said. There's something I've been wanting to say to you for a long time. He took a deep breath. The young man slowly looked up, finally met his eyes. Toshinori took another breath and said what he'd been waiting to say for over 10 years. I'm sorry. For the way I spoke to you all those years ago. It was cruel of me to crush your dreams the way I did. I strove to bring hope to those in need, but on that day, I brought you only despair. Forgive me. What? Out of all the things All Might could have said, he never expected to hear those words. Part of him wanted to accept, to not hold a grudge, to still look up to All Might. But, even after so long, resentment still burned. Izuku wanted to let it go, to accept All Might's request. But could he? You don't have to forgive me if you can't bring yourself to, All Might said. My words must have hurt so much. You'd be well within your rights to hate me for it. Izuku closed his fist. That's just it. I didn't hate you. I was sad. Then empty. But I didn't resent you. Not back then. For a time I saw it as you helping me, telling me the hard truth I needed to learn. All Might raised an eyebrow. And that changed? Izuku nodded. Yeah, it did. A year or so later when, I guess I stopped believing you. All Might looked confused. I stopped believing that it was impossible to be a hero without a quirk. I began to believe that with the right combination of gear, training, and strategy, even powerful opponents could be taken down. Don't get me wrong. I couldn't have been a hero. I was a scrawny kid with no training or skills beyond some decent quirk analysis. I never would have gotten into UA. Izuku closed his eyes, trying to keep water from forming. But you didn't say that. You didn't talk about my actual weaknesses, my plans and lack thereof. You just heard I didn't have a quirk and stopped there. I'm sorry. Sorry for what you said, or sorry for how you said it. All Might sighed. You know, my quirk came in when I was 14. Izuku's eyes widened. He can't be saying. I was once much like you. I even wanted to be a hero like you. But if I hadn't gotten my quirk, I never could have done it. As I said before, some foes can't be beaten without power. And what happens when they can't be beaten with power? Izuku said. Do the heroes just run away? All Might faltered. Young man, I'm afraid don't understand. For a moment, Izuku considered telling him, in excruciating detail, how thoroughly he'd disregarded All Might's advice, how dangerous his job was and how powerful his enemies were. But that would be cruel. If Izuku was going to tell All Might, he didn't want to do it like this. Especially since, if what All Might was saying was true, he wasn't just someone who just wrote Izuku off as weak. He was someone who'd been in the same situation and judged accordingly, however wrong he might have been. Forget it. Izuku leaned against a tree. I don't want to hate you, you know? I know you sincerely believed I couldn't do it. I know you meant well. I know you're a good man, but... The resentment lingers? Izuku nodded. Yeah, it does. He put his hands in his pocket and checked the time. I have to go. I have work to do. All Might's shoulders sagged. I see. As Izuku started to leave, All Might said, "Pardon, is that some kind of workplace joke?" He pointed at the shirt Izuku wore beneath his Uravity hoodie, the one that said, "Quirkless G-Force member. Fighting villains was too dangerous, so instead I fight Godzilla." Izuku zipped up his hoodie. "Yeah, a joke." He began walking again, but stopped. "Just please, All Might, next time a quirkless child comes up to you, don't crush his dreams. If you don't believe me that it's possible, ask the AMF what they have to deal with without quirks. You'll find it surprising." "I will remember that. By the way, what kind of work do you do?" "Pest control. And right now there are some bugs that need to be exterminated." "I'm telling you, we should drop our lines here," said Hiroshi. "And I'm telling you it's too shallow," said Ikkyo. "Is not. I've fished here before and the water is at least 50 meters deep." "Is not. Is too." Ikkyo growled. Hiroshi had been going like this all day. Drop lines here, drop lines there. We'll catch something for sure. He wished the sonar wasn't broken, otherwise he could show him what an idiot he was being. Why had Ikkyo put up with him for 30 years? Ikkyo looked over the side and, upon seeing rock-hard proof of his friend's foolishness, laughed. 50 meters, you say? Then what's that rock doing right there?" Ikkyo pointed at a medium-sized boulder sticking out of the water. The boulder was charcoal gray with a very odd surface texture. Ikkyo would never admit it, but he'd never seen a rock like it before. "Why, that wasn't there before," Hiroshi said, pointing. "Sure it wasn't," Ikkyo said. "Face it, you couldn't find your way around your own house if your wife wasn't there." "Shut up. At least mine hasn't henpecked me like yours." "I am not henpecked." "You are too, and you," Hiroshi trailed off. His eyes slowly widened as he stared over the boat's side. Ikkyo turned to see what was wrong. He gasped. The rock was looking at them. On the side of the boulder, just beneath the waterline, an enormous yellow eye had opened up and was staring right at them. For several seconds, nothing moved. Ikkyo wished he'd gone for a walk today instead of fishing, or visited a beach, or even lazed around his home. Anything that meant he wouldn't be here at this moment. Finally, the eye turned away as the rock sank into the depths. Ikkyo and Hiroshi's boat was rocked by a strong current, followed by a long serpent's tail, thick as a single-lane road lifting out of the water and slamming back down, nearly capsizing Ikkyo and Hiroshi's boat. As the two slowly recovered, Hiroshi said, I think we just saw a sea serpent." Ikkyo nodded. On second thought, maybe this wasn't a bad place to cast their lines here after all. Far away from wherever that thing was heading. The AMF carrier slowly loomed over the heroes and the small transport boat carrying them. Itsuka stared upwards, hoping up there they could finally be treated like actual partners. This morning, the AMF ordered an evacuation out of nowhere, providing no reason beyond an obscure protocol for a potential animal attack. The Kamakiras had been bad, but they weren't worth evacuating the island over. Besides, they were up by the mountain, not the shoreline the AMF were focusing. There was something else too, a tension amongst the AMF, a fear of some unspoken threat. Itsuka tried to get more information, but all of the commanding officers were busy with the coming battle or the evacuation. Itsuka could have waited until the chaos of this rather large operation calmed down and asked again, but she was fed up with being in the dark. She wanted answers. Eventually, just walked up and asked someone, but that gave her little information and a lot of sarcasm. "Hey you," Itsuka said to a passing soldier. "What's going on? Why weren't we allowed in the disaster area on the far side?" The soldier looked at her like she was insane. "You want to go there?" "Yes, we're heroes." "You actually want to go over there dressed like that?" The soldiers pointed at Splashgo's exposed chest part of his surfer aesthetic and Itsuka's bare arms and legs. "I mean, I get the levels are low. I for one wouldn't walk around all that radioactivity without full gear." Several indignant responses died in Itsuka's mouth. Radioactivity. The soldier stared at her for a long moment. "Geez, you guys really are out of the loop. Look, I need to go or the sergeant will have my head. Sorry." As he hurried away, Itsuka said, "Wait, why is the other side radioactive?" "Nuclear death dinosaur." Itsuka groaned. "If you didn't want to tell me, you could have just said so," she muttered. Seriously, nuclear dinosaur? Got any weirder ideas? Another passing soldier who Itsuka thought she'd seen at that officers' meeting said, a living pile of mutated sludge with eyes. Itsuka didn't dignify that with a response. After that, Itsuka went to the nearest command tent, demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. After being kicked to multiple places, Itsuka was given a ride to the main carrier to speak with the ranking officers there. Accompanying her were Kaminari, Tetsu, and Splash-N-Go and All Might. Itsuka glanced back at her former teacher with a frown. Ever since they found him near the park, he'd seemed haunted. Then again, Itsuka supposed that when someone had been a hero as long as All Might, he had to have seen some horrible things that were hard to shake. She hoped he was okay. On the island, Mina, Setsuna, Gyro, and the Ajiros were assisting the evacuation in town. Itsuka placed her full trust in them. It's all right, you're doing great. Just follow the line and everything'll be okay. Mina waved the crowd along while flashing her brightest smile, hoping to pass on a little cheer to the situation. Most of the town was empty, the majority of its inhabitants jammed near the piers to get on the evacuation boats. The nearby neighborhoods were also being emptied, but that was slower going. Boat after boat chugged from and to the waiting ships offshore, moving like clockwork. Mina would be impressed if this whole thing hadn't been dropped on them out of nowhere. Seriously, would it have killed the AMF to give the heroes some warning? Or share the entire plan instead of shoving part of it at the heroes and saying, work on this? Jerks. Mina ran up and down the long lines, keeping everyone as calm as she could. Fortunately, her cheerful persona was infectious and the crowd stayed mostly calm. Toru used her bright tone and peppy body language in lieu of facial expressions for obvious reasons. Ojiro's used his calmer demeanor. They helped everyone keep their heads, regardless of the hectic circumstances. Still, Mina wished Ijiro and Bakugou were here. Ijiro was great at making people feel safe and would be a tremendous help. As for Bakugou, Mina bet those AMF jerks would be a lot more reasonable with him around. Mina heard the roar of engines as 2 fighter jets passed over, flying toward the mountain. Looks like the fight was starting. Izuku noted the passing jets, right on schedule. First, the jets would hit the Kamakuras with bunker busters. If that didn't kill it, Ishikawa and Sakaki's teams would attack in a pincer formation and finish the job. Izuku's team was held in reserve by the farm fields near the town in case they had any unexpected guests. The first bombs dropped, bathing the mountain in an eerie red glow. The Kamakuras let out a defiant shriek. Kenji looked out to the sea as the psychic tremor rattled him, generated by the eruption of aggression from an all-too-familiar source. He'd heard the shriek. He would meet the challenge. He was coming, and judging by the urgency in his thoughts. Kenji looked to the massive crowd near the docks, near the water. Oh no. Kenji sprinted to the nearest soldier, nearly tackling her. Hey, what jiv? I'm Kenji Sigusa, analyst. I need your radio now. What? I need to talk with command. Give me your radio. Why? Because we have a code G. She handed him her radio. The admiral shook Itsuka's hand. He was an older man with gray hair and a scar over his eye. I am Admiral Mori. Itsuka Kendo, Pro Hero Battle Fist. An honor to meet you. The admiral nodded. Likewise. May I ask what was so important that you came all the way out here? Because, sir, my team has been told next to nothing. Half your men don't want to work with us, and we've been barred from both combat and search and rescue. We need to know what is going on and be allowed to do our jobs if we're to help, please. The admiral rubbed the bridge of his nose. My apologies for the lack of communication. Today has been hectic for us, and we aren't used to dealing with heroes in the Pacific who aren't familiar with our operations. You see? Sir. A subordinate ran over. Sir, the Kamakuras is gone, fleeing at top speed. Also, one of our analysts called and said we have a code G. The admiral's eyes widened. He turned around and hurried toward the command bridge, leaving the heroes behind. Itsuka sighed. So much for cooperation. Whatever this was, she hoped it was important. Zenikairo put a hand to his headset. Had he just heard that? He looked back at Izuku. He definitely did. Izuku's eyes blazed with the calm intensity they always showed before a battle, especially a battle against him. Izuku popped an iodine tablet and said, Turn us around. All tanks, battle positons. Zenakairo popped a tablet of his own, his heart beating like a drum. He took the tank's controls and obeyed. Mina stood up after calming yet another crying child. Looking around, she saw Mr. Fujimoto was arguing with a pair of soldiers in front of a nearby gas station. Mina ran over, calling, "Mr. Fujimoto." "Miss Ishido," he said. "They want me to get on the ships, but I'm telling them I need to get back to my home." "What's at your home?" Mina said. "My grandchildren. I left them there while I came to see what was going on," he said. "They're normally fine on their own, but I can't leave the island without them." "Where's your house?" one of the soldiers said. "On the far side of the fields," Fujimoto said, pointing. "Okay then," Mina said with a smile. "In that case?" Everything turned to chaos. There was a series of shouts from the soldiers. The evacuation boat shut its doors and cast off. Soldiers ushered everyone out of the lines they'd been waiting in, toward the buildings. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. One of the soldiers in front of Mina turned to Mr. Fujimoto. "We need to get off the streets. You can go to your house later." "Hold on," Mina said, but another voice interrupted. "You, Hiro." A young man with broad glasses in AMF gear ran up to Mina. "Can you help get these people to the roofs?" He pointed to the nearby buildings, mostly storefronts, a few hotels, and the gas station next to Mina. All of them were single-story, short enough that she could lift people with her acid man. "Yeah, why?" "There's going to be a 6-foot-tall tidal wave coming through. You need to get these people on the roofs." Mina looked around. Sure enough, the soldiers were either ushering people onto rooftops or into the few multi-story buildings near them. They used ladders taken, quirks, or even their own strength to lift people up onto the roofs. Mina turned back to the guy with glasses. "Are you sure the roofs will be high enough?" He nodded. "The wave won't be higher than 7 feet. "And what about my grandchildren?" said Fujimoto. "They're in a house beyond the fields." "That should be fine for now," the young man said. "The wave is a very localized event." Mina relayed the information to her coworkers, then ran to the nearest building, and used her acid to melt a series of handholds. She helped people climb up to the roof. Then the people at the top helped pull up the ones on the bottom. The soldiers were especially important in that part. Everyone was helping each other. "We're moving people in the hotels," Satsuna said over the comms. "The AMF won't let anyone above the 2nd floor. Say it's too dangerous." "Just keep getting them off the street," said Kendo. "We'll figure out what's going on after." "You got it, Kendo." Why did Mina feel there was more coming than just a wave? Aboard the AMF destroyer Anka, a sonar technician watched his screen as the sonar swept the ocean. A blip appeared at the edge of his screen. The sonar sent out another ping. The blip was closer, much closer. "Sir, he's heading right for the main town. By the looks of it, he's charging at full speed." Itsuka waited on the edge of the flight deck as 2 more jets lifted off. As annoying as the lack of information was, Itsuka could forgive it. A cursory glance made it clear this wasn't the AMF being obtuse like before. This was them in a borderline panic. But that raised the question, what had them so spooked? Crew members started to gather on the deck, watching the sea. Itsuka looked. There was nothing out there. The deck lurched beneath Itsuka's feet as the carrier started to move in reverse. Almost as if the crew members began shouting. The admiral rushed from the bridge to the edge of the deck and peered through a pair of binoculars. A shout rose up around Itsuka as a small area in the sea started to bulge. A helicopter flew over and shone its light down as 3 rows of jagged stone broke through the surface, cutting across the water like the dorsal fins of a massive shark. What could possibly be that big? Itsuka's eyes widened further as she realized that the rocks were heading straight for them. Mina lifted one last civilian onto the roof and looked around. Everyone was off the street. Mina jumped up and climbed onto the roof, several soldiers and civilians helping pull her up. There wasn't a single rooftop on the main street had a group of people on top. Mina looked back toward the ocean. The ocean had receded. The spines raced toward the carrier's front. Even with the carrier pulling back as quick as it could, it was going to be close. Crew members ran for the back as the moment of truth approached. 10 seconds. Itsuka braced herself. 5 seconds. Itsuka's fist tightened. 1 second. She took in a sharp intake of breath. The spines narrowly missed the carrier's front. They continued forward, ramming a destroyer and shearing its bow clean off. The destroyer spun from the hit but remained afloat. The spines continued onward like nothing happened. The ocean came roaring back. The wall of water swept through the streets, sweeping away cars, mailboxes, even small trees. Anything not bolted down was washed away. The water ran along the edges of the buildings, slowly rising, but just as the lights went out, it stopped. The AMF guy was right. The water did not reach the roof. As the water began to recede, Mina breathed out a sigh of relief. It seemed the worst was over. So why did the AMF soldiers look more scared? Itsuka squinted, trying to make out shapes in the dark. It almost looked like Battle Fist. Admiral Mori walked up to her, his tone urgent. You need to relay to your friends everything I'm about to tell you, starting with the order not to engage. Itsuka's stomach sank. Engage what? Flares were fired from a nearby roof. They arced through the air, passing an enormous, wet, scaly hide. Mina's breath stopped. Several people screamed. An enormous foot slammed down, shaking the earth. Everyone fell silent. Mina stared at the foot, then looked up. Past the column-like legs, past the hands, which looked like they could grip cars like Hot Wheels toys, past the chest which was dripping enough water to form a waterfall, up to the reptilian face that glared at the island. It can't be, Fujimoto said. It's... The monster opened its mouth and let out a thunderous roar, echoing across the land. Godzilla. Mina stared upward, frozen as she briefly forgot her hero instincts. The monster towered over the buildings, the tallest one barely coming up to its knees. Floodwater flowed around its toes like a shallow creek, while the creature's tail swayed lazily behind it, occasionally landing in the water and sending a spray onto the nearby buildings. The monster stepped forward. Mina shook her head. She needed to get these people off the building. Fortunately, the AMF had started doing just that, either lifting civilians down the side opposite the monster, or standing on the ground to catch ones who jumped. Mina would have used her more viscous acid down to act as a landing mat, but that would be difficult with the water, which was still a few feet deep, so she opted to help people lower themselves off the roof. Mina glanced to the side and saw the soldiers on the other roofs doing the same, helping get the people off the roofs and out of harm's way. However, as Mina worked, the tremors grew stronger as a series of massive splashes grew louder. Soon everyone was off the roof. Mina crawled over the edge and hopped down, landing in thigh-high waters. She looked down the side of the building and saw the monster lumbering past, its footsteps sending wakes down the alleyway. All right, Mina, you can do this. He may be big, but you're fast. Go in, aim at the legs and... All heroes, this is Battle Fist, Kendo. Do not engage the creature that just came ashore. I repeat, do not engage. What? Mina said. You can't just expect us to sit here while he tears the place to pieces. I don't like I either, but according to the AMF we need to avoid fighting him. The monster let out another roar, his tail smashing down on some buildings. Screw it. Mina had to do something. She'd taken a few steps when a hand grabbed her arm. It was the AMF guy from before, the one with glasses. Hey, what gives? You can't fight Godzilla, he said. I can't just let him destroy this place, she said, wrenching her hand from his grip. I analyze him for a living, Glasses Boy said. None of your attacks can even faze him. You're useless fighting him. Mina opened her mouth, but another voice came over the comms. One she was sure she'd heard at the start of the Mantis fight. None of you are strong enough. If you want to help, then help move the bystanders out of his path and let us handle the combat. Kendo's voice returned. He's right. I just saw that thing cut clean through a naval destroyer like it was nothing. Focus on the people who still need to be evacuated. The AMF are giving me the areas we need to clear right now. Mina clenched her fist. She hated this, but they were right. All right, tell me where I need to go. Izuku listened to the heroes give out their instructions. He glanced down his scope on thermal mode. Godzilla stood out like a small sun, a mass of red towering over a sea of blue. He looked almost like an ancient god come to bring vengeance on the helpless mortals. In a way, he kind of was. Godzilla raised his head, searching. He soon lowered it, having realized his enemy was no longer here. He continued forward, evidently wanting to explore the dry land. Much as Izuku might want to let him, there were people on this island, and he and the AMF couldn't let Godzilla hurt them. Izuku gripped his controls, ready for anything. He hoped this didn't erupt into a full-scale battle, but if it did, he would fight. Mina received the last of her instructions and signed off. The monster's tail idly passed over her before swinging over and smashing a building across the street. It had barely come ashore and already destroyed several buildings. This was bad. The water had receded to the point where Mina could slide using her quirk. She got into a ready stance. Here goes nothing. Alien Queen. Mina turned to the analyst. He hesitated. Good luck. Mina smiled. Thanks. She set off after the monster. She passed the highest point the tidal wave had reached, but even past that the streets were wet, soaked just from by the water dripping from the monster's hide. Mina followed the monster, slowly gaining. For an animal that walked with such a slow gait, this thing was fast. Then again, when you were that big, you got a lot more mileage out of each footstep. Even with that, Mina was soon able to pull ahead of the creature and sound the alarm. Everyone evacuate. Get out of here. Don't take anything, just run. Most didn't need the warning. Around Mina, people fled for their lives, turning down side streets, or even running into backyards to escape the monster's wrath. Mina did her best to give advice, especially to those running into the monster's path, instead of running out of its way and help any who needed it. However, she could never afford to stop for long since there were more people ahead she needed to warn. The monster towered over the neighborhood like a living mountain. Plumes of dust and smoke billowed behind it as it plowed through anything in its path. It had been less than 5 minutes since it landed, and this was already a disaster. As Mina got further ahead, she started to see civilians poking their heads out to investigate the commotion in lieu of running. Mina waved her arms. Everybody out, hurry, don't grab anything, just run. Her words, coupled with the 50-meter monster behind her, were all the motivation they needed. The civilians sprang from their houses and scattered like frightened mice. One even threw himself out a window to escape. He was up and running a few moments later. As Mina continued, one of the tremors from the monster's footfalls made her lose her footing. Mina tumbled to the ground and rolled onto her side. She groaned. That hurt. As Mina looked up, she saw the monster's foot falling right toward her. Oh shit! Mina rolled sideways, narrowly avoiding the foot smashing into the ground. The shockwave from the footfall lifted Mina clear off the ground, while a blast louder than Bakugou's explosions rang in her ears. As Mina recovered, she realized she had an opportunity. She sprang to her feet and leapt at the foot. Maximum viscosity, acidmin. Mina's body was enveloped in a layer of viscous acid, until it had formed a pudgy body of acid with Mina at the center. Mina swiped at the monster's foot, raking her acid over it, before leaping away and shedding her acidmin form. Given the potency of the acid, it should. The foot lifted continued onward. Not even a flinch. On the area Mina had hit, there was nothing. No melting scales, not even a shallow groove. Just nothing. Her attack had been utterly fruitless. Even the mantises weren't that strong. Mina stared for several seconds before coming to her senses. She had a job to do. Mina again pulled ahead and sounded the alarm. Fortunately, the further she got, the more warning people had received. Now the streets were near deserted, with only a few stragglers needing Mina's help. Through it all, she was always aware of the ever-steady drumbeat behind her. Mina finally reached the end of the block and was about to hightail it when she saw a woman in the second-story window of the last house. The woman reached down and pulled a bundle into her arms. Mina looked back toward the approaching monster. It was heading right for them. Mina leaped at the house and, using her acid to create handholds, scrambled up to the second story and dissolved the wall next to the window. She rushed in and pointed at the woman. You! The woman turned. We need to get out of here. Grab your... She glanced at the bundle. Are those action figures? They're collectibles. Before Mina could properly strangle this moron, the ground shook. Mina turned. A massive foot had landed on the street several meters in front of them. There was a loud crashing to their side. The other foot, which meant, come on. Mina grabbed the woman and dragged her out the door and down the hall, sprinting toward the side of the house. She melted a hole and created a small acid mat at the bottom. There was a loud crashing behind Mina. She threw herself and the woman out the hole and huddled down. Just as they landed, the giant foot kicked clean through the house and flattened the backyard. There was another footstep further away. The foot next to them lifted. Soon the monster was moving away, until its tail dragging over the former house's foundation. The woman stared. My home. Mina got to her feet. Just be glad it wasn't you. Itsuko watched the monster, Godzilla, making his way across the island. If this was the monster from the island's folklore, then legends hadn't done it justice. The creature destroyed everything in its wake, without even trying. It was like a typhoon concentrated into a single body. Watching it made Itsuka feel small. In all my years, All Might said, I've rarely seen anything that big, or that effortlessly destructive. Given what he'd seen, that was an impressive distinction. Itsuka continued to direct her friends, focusing on neighborhoods that hadn't been evacuated prior. Fortunately, a lot of the people were already running for it. This came with problems of its own, but it was a definite help. Also, Setsuna and Gyro had mostly evacuated the neighborhoods the AMF was about to lead Godzilla through. Now they just had to mop up any stragglers in the ones the AMF had evacuated earlier today. Battle Fist, Admiral Mori said. We're about to drop flares. Itsuka nodded. Into her comms she said, all right, everyone get ready. If all goes to plan, he's about to change directions. Setsuna put a finger to her earpiece. Got it. I'm already in the original evac zone with earphone jack. We'll work as fast as we can. Good. Alien Queen, continue your evacuation work. Once he changes direction, make your way back to the main base in town. Good luck, everyone. Thanks, Battle Fist. Setsuna signed off and sighed. Gyro was using her quirk to locate people. Fortunately, there were few, but the area they had to cover was vast. They had too few heroes for an operation of this magnitude, and Setsuna and Gyro could only do so much on their own. Yet they had to keep trying. Come on, this way, away from the monster. Mina directed the last civilians out of the monster's path. By now, nearly everyone had already fled. However, a few still lagged behind, either because of bad luck, being slow to leave their homes, or because they'd run back inside for shelter. That last category was a particular problem. Mina had seen 5 and helped 4. Most of them left their refuges after a simple order, but one had needed to be forced, and that was the ones Mina had seen. There were plenty she'd failed to notice completely. She had to hope the monster didn't go near them. If it didn't, Mina had watched the 5th civilian huddled in their living room as a reptilian foot leveled their house. She hoped that was the exception, not the rule. Mina grabbed a hapless civilian about to run in the direction they were about to drive the monster. No, you don't. Run the other way. That was when she heard the roar of engines overhead. A group of jet fighters passed over. They flew past the fields and dropped flares. The monster stopped its deadly advance. It turned toward the flares and stared, its yellow eyes fixated on the new source of light. Mina held her breath. Come on. The monster turned. Yes, however, as it turned, its tail swept out. Mina tackled the civilian to the ground just as the tail passed over them, slicing clean through multiple homes. The monster continued forward, kicking through yet more on the way. Mina got to her feet. The civilian she'd saved ran away while Mina took in the row of destroyed houses behind her. All that from the simple act of turning. She caught sight of a hand sticking out of a destroyed house. She went over and felt for a pulse. There was none. Mina of that day in high school when Aizawa-sensei looked each of her class in the eye and said, I know you all like to promise yourselves you'll save everybody. It's a worthy goal to aspire to, something every hero desires. But the hard truth is you can't. You must accept that and keep moving. Mina sighed. She'd done all she could hear. Time to... And what about my grandchildren? They're in a house beyond the fields. As the memory flashed in Mina's mind, she looked where the monster was heading. The fields. Mina clenched her fist. She told Kendo where she was going and once again set off. Setsuna and Gyro rushed to get everyone away as the creature approached. They narrowed their search in response to its current trajectory, while Gyro used much stronger sonar pulses that cracked the asphalt. They needed to get any and everyone out, and they needed to do it now. After ushering one last civilian to safety, Setsuna recalled most of her pieces to herself and flew back to Gyro. Are there any more left? No, that's the Gyro's eyes widened. People coming. A lot of them, she pointed. Setsuna turned and saw dozens of AMF infantry riding on motorcycles with rocket launchers strapped to their backs. They were not. The leader Gondo pointed at the two heroes. You two? How many left? Aside from you? None, Gyro said. He nodded. Good. You two get out of here. Everyone else, take positions. Rock teams, hold fire until ordered and try not to get stepped on. If he moves off course, we're gonna be to him what a Lego brick lying on the floor is to the bare foot. Mortar teams, take positions on the edge of the neighborhood. When the order comes, I want a bonfire that Shoto couldn't beat. Yes, sir. The soldiers raced in various directions, taking positions all around the neighborhood. Hold on, you're not going to try and fight that thing, are you? Gyro said. Only if the situation calls for it, Gondo said. We're hoping the flares do the trick. If they don't, he patted his rocket launcher. That's suicide, said Setsuna. That's G-force, said Gondo. Now, you two get out of here. But we can help you, said Gyro. My amplifiers. No, he said, his tone brokering no disagreement. Godzilla is ours. G back to the main base. There'll be work to do there. He mounted his bike and rode off. Setsuna sighed. He's right. Let's go. Gyro nodded. Yeah. Setsuna picked up Gyro and flew back toward town. Izuku looked between his scope and his tank's viewing screen. Godzilla was still following the flares, but he was starting losing interest. He could change directions any moment. Come on, keep following the strange lights. If Godzilla turned before reaching the fields, they might have to engage to steer him back. That could get ugly. Very ugly. A battle was the last thing this town needed right now. Just a little further. Come on. Finally, Godzilla cleared the last of the buildings, stepping onto the farm fields. He was in range. Izuku locked target in case he was needed. Godzilla turned toward the nearby hills, away from the shoreline the AMF was trying to get him to go towards. Fortunately, they had one last trick to direct his attention before using the masers and provoking a fight. Napalm bombardment, said Sakaki. Open fire. Squads of jets dove down and fired their missiles in front of Godzilla, sending plumes of fire into the air. Tanks and artillery batteries stationed around the fields opened up, blasting the ground around him, turning it into an inferno. Gondo turned to his men. Fire mortars. The booming of mortars filled the neighborhood, accompanied by the whistling of shells. They landed around Godzilla, creating yet more flames around his dark silhouette, which advanced into them with a thundering roar. Gondo smirked. That's it, you overly aggressive asshole. Follow the fire, advance into the attack, just like you always do. As Godzilla began to pass the flaming portions of the fields, another squad of jets dove down and fired. Missile after missile struck the ground, creating a sea of flames for Godzilla to wade through. So far, so good. Izuku kept his scope locked on the air just above Godzilla's eye. Sakaki had ordered him to miss after all. Godzilla's head was dipped slightly down and his arms were held slightly wider than normal, an attack pose. He was ready for a fight, but they hadn't done enough to provoke him yet. With a little luck, it would stay that way. A voice came over the comms. All units, be advised. Pro-hero alien queen is trying to rescue civilian children in a house past the field. Keep your eyes open to avoid friendly fire. Upon hearing the order, Shinichi leapt onto the nearest house to get a proper vantage point, his enhanced eyesight giving him a clear view of everything. The only way past the fields would be a road to Godzilla's right. It led down the fields, with the nearest house just past the trees on the far end. At the rate he was going, Godzilla would be there within minutes. A pink and turquoise shape made its way onto the road. Alien Queen. By the looks of it, she could make it, but it would be close. Too close. Shinichi turned toward Gondo. Seemingly knowing what Shinichi was about to ask, Gondo nodded. Shinichi cast aside his launcher and sprinted off across an untouched stretch of field before leaping onto the road. As he rushed to catch up with Alien Queen, Shinichi couldn't help but think about how Kazama would be furious when he found out what Shinichi was about to do. Mina looked back at the monster as it continued forward. Flames continued to erupt around it, some going as high as the monster's head. Plumes of smoke curled around the creature while the fire lit it with an eerie orange glow, making it look like something from of hell itself. Where were those laser tanks from earlier? They'd attacked the mantises without hesitation, so why not this thing? After all, it may be big, but it is still just a lizard, right? A blast of napalm went off just in front of the creature, sending a jet of flames right into its face. The monster reared back, letting out a surprised roar. When it lowered its head back down, Mina saw fire continuing to burn on its face. The monster didn't thrash, it didn't panic, it didn't even roar. It just continued onward, not even noticing the flames. What kind of monster was this thing? Damn, said Zenny. His face caught fire and he just kept walking. Not much rattles him, does it? When you've survived atomic weapons, what's a little napalm? Izuku said. Despite this, he'd be re-watching that moment from their feeds later. A lot. I guess, Zenny said. He took a deep breath. Izuku could see the tension in his shoulders as he waited for the moment the two would be needed. Izuku, though, felt calm. All errant thoughts, all mental turmoil, all the little things buzzing in his head 247, they had ceased. Everything was turned to the fight. Izuku knew exactly where he was and what he had to do. He simultaneously felt completely alert and completely at peace. He continued watching Godzilla, analyzing his every move and planning accordingly. Takumi flew his jet into another attack run. He took aim. Target locked on. Firing. He sent 2 missiles down, detonating just in front of Godzilla, followed by several more from his wingman. As his jet passed over the kaiju, Godzilla looked up. Takumi's hand tightened on his controls. For a terrifying moment, Godzilla stared right at him. Takumi braced himself, wondering if the kaiju would attack. Finally, Godzilla looked away, apparently uninterested. Takumi let out several breaths. That was close. Those were my last missiles, his wingman Hakaru said. I'm out too, said Takumi. Finally, they could get out of there. As they returned to the carrier, Takumi saw another group of planes passing by, heading toward the battle. So it continues. Target is maintaining course. At this rate, he will be at the coast in 4 minutes. That's good, Zenny said. Maybe they won't need us after all. Izuku continued watching Godzilla. I jinxed it, didn't I? Izuku continued watching Godzilla. Never mind. Izuku looked down at the bright dot on the road. Come on, alien queen. Hurry up. He looked at Godzilla, then back at her. At the speed she was going at, she might make it in and out without any trouble. But if she couldn't, Yashiro, Akiba, move away from my position and get ready to take cover. Zenny. Zenny turned, his grim expression telling Izuku he already knew what Izuku was about to say. Get ready to bolt. Mina was almost to the house. Just a little more. Hearing footsteps behind her, Mina turned and saw someone catching up to her. Dark uniform, biker aesthetic, black spiky hair. Oh yeah, he was one of those AMF guys who used quirks. Mina reached the house and skidded to a stop. The AMF guy came to a stop in front of her. What could he want? He'd better not be here to tell her to stop. My name's Ozaki. I heard about the civilians and thought you could use some help, especially with him so near. He flicked his head toward the approaching monster. Oh well, that's a nice change in pace. Mina nodded. Glad to have any help I can get. Let's go. They ran up to the house. She hoped it was the right one. It was the only house remotely nearby, and it would take precious time to get to any others. She glanced back at the dark shadow slowly, but surely approaching through the flames. They had to hurry. Ozaki grabbed the door and ripped it clean off its hinges before throwing it away. Mina and him raced in. All the lights were off, and Mina couldn't hear a sound. Was this the wrong house? 2 people down the hall, both young and breathing heavily, Ozaki said. Mina nodded and stepped into the hall. Hello? Is there anyone in here? We're heroes. Which one? Relief filled Mina. That definitely sounded like a child. They'd found the right house. I'm the pro-hero alien queen, she said in a cheerful tone. Me and my friend are here to get you out of here. Alien queen. 2 children poked their heads out from behind a door, a boy and a girl. The boy's eyes grew wide as saucers upon seeing Mina. Mina smiled at them and knelt down. Yep, it's me, your friendly acid hero, and everything's going to okay. This was the promise All Might taught her class to always make, to save their hearts as well as their lives. The explosions grew closer. Speaking of saving their lives, we need to hurry up and leave, Mina said, hurrying over to them. Now follow me and... The ground trembled. It trembled again. And again, the tremors getting stronger with each second. He's almost here, Ozaki said. He grabbed the girl in his arms while Mina lifted the boy. Hang on, Mina said. The two sprinted out the door, with Ozaki easily outpacing Mina. The monster was almost on top of them, his enormous body towering over the measly house. Mina slid away as fast as she could. She felt a footfall behind her. Then another, accompanied by the sound of the house crumpling beneath it. Not that way, Ozaki yelled. This way. Mina turned and saw that he'd run in a completely direction from Mina. She looked behind her and realized why. She was right in the monster's path. Oh no. The monster's foot began to lift. Mina gripped the boy tighter. Before the monster could take a step, two beams of energy shot right past its face. The monster halted and turned its head in the direction they'd come from. It turned back and began to step again, only for another two blasts to come, hitting it square in the eye. Go, Izuku said. Their tank was already racing forward at full speed, moving as far as it could from their initial location. Godzilla let out an enraged roar as he turned to face them. The good news? Izuku had successfully distracted Godzilla, giving Alien Queen a chance to escape. The bad news? He now had Godzilla's full and undivided attention. Godzilla's tail swayed as he searched for his attackers. Then, the back of his silhouette began to flash blue. X closed the last panel. Done, he turned to Mifune. We're ready to go. He swept his hand toward their machine. Would you like to do the honors, Doctor? Mifune stood up and stepped toward their device. Finally, it is time. Mina dashed into the grass as fast as her legs could carry her, moving perpendicular to the monster toward Ozaki. Hearing a series of pulses behind her, Mina looked. The jagged spines on the creature's back were glowing blue. What now? Mifune lifted the plastic cover over the activation switch. He held his thumb over it. One simple bit of pressure, and it would be done. He moved his thumb downward. Godzilla opened his mouth, revealing the blue glow in the back of his throat. Was this finally it? If so, Izuku might as well get ready to get one last shot in before he died. He aimed at the eye. The glow in Godzilla's throat grew brighter and brighter. Blue plasma filled his mouth. Then, Mifune pressed the switch. Kenji looked out to sea. Godzilla closed his mouth and turned around. What? Godzilla looked out toward the coastline for several seconds. He let out a ferocious roar and began moving toward the coast. He gradually accelerated until he was in a full charge, something he never did without another monster present. Godzilla leapt from bluffs and landed with a resounding splash. As Izuku tried to wrap his head around what just happened, someone over the comms said, Godzilla has entered the sea. He's already booking it out of here. All ground units, stand down. Is that a good thing? Zenny said. No, Izuku said. I don't think it is. Mina let out a sigh of relief. It's gone. It's finally gone. Ozaki walked toward her, the girl still in his arms. Alien Queen, are you all right? Mina nodded. Yeah, we're okay. You? Fine. Mina nodded. Good. She looked toward the destroyed house, then back at Ozaki. Thank you. Glad we could work together for a change. He nodded. You're welcome. I'm glad too. He stepped toward the cliffs and looking where the monster had vanished. Mina turned and looked where it had come from, where the fields continued to burn. Toru stared at the remains of the town. It almost didn't feel real, like this was a bad dream. A trail of devastation had been left in the creature's wake, with houses destroyed, buildings leveled, and a trail of footprints running through them all. If Toru listened closely, she could even hear distant cries for help. Dozens were sure to be wounded or dead. Toru felt Mashiro's hand slipping into hers. She squeezed it. A few minutes. He did all of this in just a few minutes. Mina tried to hide her exhaustion and keep a brave face for these children. Yet, now that the danger was over, it was hard to fight off the growing weight in her limbs. After the monster returned to the sea, Ozaki's brother had arrived. He'd been irritated. "You idiot," he said, getting into Ozaki's face. "What were you thinking? You heard the heroes were doing a rescue and decided to run toward Godzilla? Even for you that was dumb." "What was I supposed to do? Leave them to die?" Ozaki said. Ozaki's brother opened his mouth, then glanced at the two kids, who were now sitting by Mina. "Your brother did help save them, you know," Mina said. "I'm not sure I could have done it on my own." Ozaki's brother huffed and walked away to brood. Mina rolled her eyes. There's always one. Shortly afterwards, a group of AMF vehicles picked up Mina and Fujimoto's grandchildren, while Ozaki and his brother went to rejoin their unit on foot. During the ride back to town, the kids clung to Mina like a safety blanket. Mina put her arms around them to comfort them as the adrenaline faded. Fortunately, they were asleep in her arms before she could crash. While she sat there unmoving in the truck, the scale of the night sank in. All that destruction. Mina knew it was bad to dwell, but she couldn't stop the thoughts from coming. How many people had died? How many could have been saved? Could she have? The truck came to a halt and the door opened. Mina shook the two kids. "Wake up. It's time to see your grandfather." They blinked their eyes open. The boy yawned, opened his eyes, then realized where he was shot straight up blushing. Mina tried to keep from giggling. His embarrassment was too cute. Once the kids were on the ground, Mina got to her feet and hopped out of the truck. A soldier dressed head to toe in thick gear with a gas mask covering his face gestured to them. "Follow me. We're going to get you decontaminated." "Decontaminated? Oh right, radioactive monster." "We won't be in danger, will we?" Mina said. "Probably not," the soldier said. "The dosage was probably low. If not, they'll tell you. Trust me." He led them to a set of makeshift showers, where technicians pointed Geiger counters on them before ushering them in. Once inside, pink steam filled the chamber, carrying the smell of peaches. Mina leaned against the back wall and waited. Outside, AMF personnel looked at some sort of readout, while others lined people up to enter after her. Soon the door opened and Mina walked out with the two children. "You're clean," a technician said. "The dosage was minimal, so you shouldn't have much to worry about. Move along and make way for others." He waved them away as another group were sent in. After Mina and the kids had gone a few meters, they saw a familiar figure waiting for them. "Grandpa." The kids ran to meet Mr. Fujimoto, who embraced his grandchildren with a look of profound relief. "Ikiro, Yuri." "We were so scared, Grandpa. That big dinosaur came, and we didn't know where to go." Fujimoto held them tighter. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm so glad you're both safe." He looked to Mina. "Thank you, Miss Ishido. Thank you so much." Mina gave him a tired smile. "Don't mention it. I'm just glad it turned out okay." The two kids ran over and hugged Mina. "Thank you, Miss Alien Queen," the girl said. "You're amazing," the boy said while looking at the ground. Mina smiled and ruffled the two's hair. "I'm just glad you two are okay. You stay with your grandfather now, and be good," she waved while the three walked away, following the other refugees. Mina looked around the nearby area, trying to find where to go. Around her, people were being led by AMF soldiers in various directions. Toward tents, toward buses, toward the decontamination steam baths, etc. Then there the wounded. They were either taken to a large tent or to the decontamination chambers, then the tent. The more severe-looking cases were taken to a smaller tent, staffed by people in full protective gear. So many wounded. Mina looked back and forth between the devastated town, the refugees, and the wounded. Where could she even start? Mina took a deep breath. Easy. She could do this. She'd done it before. When faced with an overwhelming task, she just needed to center herself, find a place she was needed, and start helping. Mina took a deep breath and started walking toward the nearest group of refugees when she heard a voice next to her. "Miss?" Mina turned. A soldier holding a spare protective suit walked up to her. "You and your colleagues have been given authorization to help with crowd control, search and rescue, and first aid if necessary. I was also told to give you this." He held out the hazmat suit. "You're to wear this if you go into any contaminated areas. Standard protocol." He handed her the suit and walked away. Not friendly, but not hostile either. She'd call that an improvement. Mina could help with the search and rescue, but with the protective clothing her quirk would be useless. Besides, while she wasn't bad at it, she wasn't a rescue hero. She was, however, a people person. She'd probably be the most help assisting the refugees. Mina was about to turn on her comms and confirm with Kendo when she saw a group of infantrymen. The same she'd met in the Mantis battle had that really only been a couple days ago, returning to the camp. They were carrying bazookas, and Mina could smell smoke gunpowder. "You didn't fight that thing, did you?" Mina said as they passed. The leader, Gondo, said, "Not this time. Just fired some mortars over the side." As he walked onward, another said, "Still lost some guys. Stood too close to the tail." As the group walked away, headlights appeared. 3 of the laser tanks rolled into camp. As they neared Mina, she noticed the graffiti covering them. Each tank's markings were different, but there was one consistent element. A gray dinosaur with yellow eyes and spines on its back. Him. Between that and Gondo's comment of "this time," Mina couldn't help but wonder, how often do they fight that thing? The leading tank passed Mina, letting her see the words "former property of Uravity" written in pink near the front. Mina scratched her head before shaking it off. She could puzzle that after the disaster was contained. Mina checked in with Kendo before jogging over soldiers shepherding the refugees. She soon found the guy in charge was given a job helping to usher them. Many were shaken by the night's events, but fortunately, Mina's presence alone seemed to set them at ease. Izuku stepped off the boat and into a nightmare. The town was devastated, ravaged by the initial wave before being trampled by that walking natural disaster. Several buildings were leveled, and others ravaged beyond repair. She'd seen powerful villains do less during trigger-fueled rampages. And Godzilla simply walked. Izuku did her best to organize her fellow heroes, sending them where they were best suited. Tetsu donned protective gear and joined the rescue efforts. His quirk was well suited to the task since it gave him enhanced strength that the suit wouldn't hinder. Satsuna joined him. She could split apart inside the hazmat suit and float upwards to search from above. Gyro would stand just outside the quarantine zone and use her quirk to detect survivors from a distance. Suboptimal but necessary given the AMF's rules. Mina, Kaminari, Splashgo, and the Ajiros would stay with the refugees and help keep them calm. In the meantime, Izuku and All Might would coordinate with the AMF officers to avoid any confrontation between the two groups. The disaster may have made the AMF more cooperative, but many of them still didn't like the heroes. They couldn't afford to shatter this brief alliance now. With any luck, All Might's prestige as the former symbol of peace would give their requests some extra weight. Or at least she hoped it would. Izuku and All Might approached the command tent. Izuku glanced at the nearby tanks. Technicians examined them with Geiger counters while a group of people she assumed to be the tank's crew members stood nearby chatting. Just as Izuku was about to reach for the tent flap, a man her age with green hair walked out. He nodded at her before walking toward the tank crews. Izuku opened the tent and held it open for All Might. He wasn't following her. Instead, he was staring at the tank crew with a stunned expression, like he'd seen a ghost. Izuku frowned. "All Might?" He started and turned to her. "Oh, sorry, young Kendo. I was just distracted, that's all." He stepped toward the tent, leaning on his cane. For a moment, he looked less like the teacher she'd looked up to in high school and more like a tired old man. Unfortunately, they couldn't afford to let him be that right now. As much as he deserved his rest, they needed him to be an experienced hero with insights to share. "How was the debrief, fearless leader?" said Akiba. "Fine," Izuku said. "I told them everything I could, and no, I did not go overboard on the details," he added while throwing a look at Zenny. "Emphasis on the words this time," Zenny said with a smirk. Izuku threw his treacherous driver a dirty look before continuing. "Sakaki will be here soon. He wants to hear my report personally." The team winced. Izuku didn't blame them. After returning to the ocean, Godzilla set off in the exact opposite direction from where they wanted him going, and no amount of torpedoes or depth charges could deter him. Sakaki, whose temper came perilously close to breaking Izuku's scale of 1 to Kaken, would naturally not be pleased. At least he would probably be professional enough to not blow up on the job. Probably. Soon, Izuku heard the rumbling of tank treads as 6 MBA 93s rolled in. Sakaki leapt from his tank and stormed to Izuku, stopping only to let the technicians clear him with their Geiger counters before continuing on the warpath. "Midoriya, what the hell happened out there?" "I don't know, sir," Izuku said. He broke off his attack and left. Sakaki's eyes widened. His glare intensified. He did what? He broke off his attack and left. Sakaki's gaze grew eerily calm. Why? I don't know. Sakaki's eyes narrowed. Bullshit. No one knows him better than you. You have to have some idea. I don't, Izuku said. I fired at him and hit his eye. He prepared his breath, but just as he was about to fire, he just closed his mouth and hurried into the sea. Sakaki's eyes widened. He knew Godzilla too. Godzilla was aggressive, vicious. He didn't just stop. Not like that. And you've never seen him do that before? Sakaki said. Izuku shook his head. What about you? No, I haven't, Sakaki said. By the way, why did you hit him? You were ordered you to miss. He got too close to Alien Queen and the civilians and I decided to distract him. Sakaki nodded. Fine. He paced. But if you hit him like that, why the hell would he? Sir. Kenji ran over to them. He saluted Sakaki. You wish to see me? Sigusa, Sakaki said, you're a skilled analyst. You know Godzilla's behavior. You've even read his mind. Why did he retreat when he did? Kenji took off his glasses and fidgeted with them. I'm not sure. Something definitely provoked him to move like that. I felt something, some sort of psychic tremor before it happened. When I reached his mind afterward, he was intent on following something out there. Something familiar. Can you read whatever it is that caused that tremor? Sakaki said. No, Kenji said. Something feels off. I don't know what it is, but something's wrong. Sakaki sighed. Shit. He turned and glared out to sea in the direction Godzilla had vanished. Whatever this is, it's far from over. He was probably right. Whatever attracted Godzilla's attention, it bode poorly for all of them. It was almost strange to be taking an active role again after all these years. Yet here Toshinori was, helping to coordinate the heroes and the AMF in their disaster relief efforts. Fortunately, his many years as the #1 hero made him a fountain of wisdom for managing a disaster, and the AMF respected that. Even the ones who hated heroes listened to him, the valuable experience he carried outweighing any misgivings they had of his former profession. Morning had come and gone, but search and rescue teams still combed the disaster area, with the help of several of his former students. Fortunately, the AMF are more accepting of the heroes' help than they'd been before or during the attack. Maybe the attack had shaken them out of their resentment, or maybe they were now working in the roles the AMF were used to heroes in, and thus no longer perceived as butting into the AMF's business. It might have helped that the heroes were too overwhelmed by everything that happened to argue with the AMF today. That creature had been enormous. Toshinori had rarely, if ever, seen anything that big before. As for the damage it left behind, Toshinori had seen worse. They all had. However, such destruction was usually from a natural disaster, or a ferocious battle. The monster caused it with his size alone. Toshinori remembered the previous generation mentioning the name Godzilla when he was young, but he hadn't paid much attention to it. He was too focused on becoming a symbol of peace. Now he wished he'd listened closer. The creature evoked an aura of helplessness in many of those who'd watched. Where All for One once radiated malice, Godzilla radiated indifference. The town beneath its feet, the heroes struggling to save it, the people it killed, they were all beneath notice to it. It cared as much about devastating a town as a person would about stepping on an anthill. Toshinori wiped his eyes and suppressed a yawn. Now that most of the setting up was accomplished, the AMF and young Kendo suggested Toshinori go get some sleep. He resisted, but they were rather insistent. The AMF offered to escort him to an available tent, but Toshinori convinced them to let him go himself. After receiving directions, Toshinori set off through the camp. On his way through, civilians would greet him, thanking him for his work as All Might. Even the AMF soldiers would give him a respectful nod as he passed, if not fanboy over him like the civilians. Toshinori passed a row of tents and spotted young Ashido carrying a heavy sack. Young Ashido. She looked up and smiled. All Might, how are you doing? I'm doing well, Toshinori said. I must admit, stressful as it is, it feels refreshing to be working again. Young Ishido gave him a tired smile. Wish it could have been in better circumstances, but take what you get. By the way, did you hear Bakugou's finally coming here? With how much he dragged his feet, I'm wondering if he waited for a disaster to hit on purpose. Toshinori chuckled. Young Bakugou is capable of many things. Clairvoyance is not one of them. If it was, he might have avoided that one-sided beatdown Toshinori gave him in the first term final exams. Young Ishido giggled. Yeah, good point. He'd probably have tried to come here and fight that thing if he knew. Young Ishido's smile faded. She sighed. You know, I heard they deal with dangerous wildlife further out in the Pacific, but I didn't expect something like that. That Godzilla was freaking huge. Toshinori nodded. It makes me wish I'd visited the more islands more often. I was always too busy to get around to it. Don't beat yourself up over it, young Ishido said. Even you can't be everywhere. I suppose that's true. Yeah. You may have been the symbol of peace, but even you have ugh. She lifted the bag off of her shoulder and placed it on a pile of similar ones. Limits. She turned to a nearby soldier taking inventory. Yo, anything else I can help with? He glanced at her. Some guys need help passing out food over there. He pointed toward some people with food, then walked off. Not exactly welcoming, young Ishido said, but better than before. I guess they're too distracted by the job to properly hate us now, huh? Toshinori nodded. Hopefully. It's shameful you had to deal with that earlier. Even with the looming threat of Godzilla, they should have remembered to include. Young Ishido waved her hand. Relax, they've been including us a lot better since the Godzilla attack. Who knows, maybe this will help improve cross-team teamwork in the future. She stretched her arms over her head and said, I'd better go. Take care. You too, young Ishido. She swung around and walked off with a light spring in her step. After a few meters, it faded for a slower trudge. She may be good at hiding it, but Toshinori could tell that young Ishido was as worn out as the rest of them. Toshinori was about to continue on his way when something caught his eye. The young man, the one with the green hair, the one Toshinori learned drove a tank against that monster last night. He was helping to lift some boxes off a truck with several of his peers. While Toshinori couldn't hear what they were saying, he could tell they were bantering. One of them said a joke, and the young man smiled and laughed with the rest of them. Toshinori hadn't seen him smile before. A pair of soldiers near Toshinori spoke in low voices, pointing at the young man's group. Toshinori overheard the word green and something about someone being crazy. Curious, Toshinori approached them, but due to his slow gait, damn you old age, they were gone before he could reach them. He looked around and noticed a woman with short brown hair walking by. Excuse me, miss, do you have a moment? The woman raised an eyebrow. All might, of course, what do you need? Toshinori pointed. That young man there, do you know who he is? Him? That's Izukumidoriya, known by some as the Emerald Madman. She had a fond smile as she said the last part. Toshinori felt a sinking in his non-existent stomach. Emerald Madman? Yeah. He has a reputation for taking massive risks for the sake of the mission, especially when protecting civilians or squad mates. It's exaggerated, but he has pulled some maneuvers that absolutely should have killed him. There was a hint of irritation in her tone on the last part. More importantly, she continued, he's notorious for having stayed in G-Force for 6 years. G-Force? Oh, sorry, that's what we like to call ourselves. Our portion of the AMF is technically called Task Force 54. We guard the portion of the Pacific where Godzilla spends most of his time and are the ones usually tasked with fighting him. Toshinori slowly nodded. So, that young man has been facing Godzilla 6 years? That's strange. She nodded. Yup. Pay stops increasing at 3, so most people stop then. After all, not many want to keep fighting Godzilla for long. Yes, Toshinori said, a coldness spreading over him. That creature was quite the menace last night. The woman gave him a look. Last night a good night, she said. You don't want to know what a bad night is. There's a reason the AMF offers high pay and very generous life insurance to be here. As good as Midoriya is, he's lucky to have gone as long as he has without more teammates dying. So, despite everyone else leaving after 3 years, he just stayed? Toshinori said. She nodded. Even when his partner left after 4 years, he never even considered leaving. And he shows no sign of leaving now. She shook her head. No, I don't even know if he can leave. Toshinori raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? She shrugged. Godzilla gives him purpose. He's obsessed with the thing, studying its powers, its history, personality. His personal hero, regarded as our greatest soldier, chased Godzilla for 50 years. Nothing fires Midoriya up like Godzilla, not even other kaiju. I don't know what he'd do without it. I see, Toshinori said. Thank you for telling me. Sorry for taking your time, miss. Akane? Nice to meet you all, Might. She turned to walk away, then stopped. By the way, I have a friend who has a daughter and... Toshinori passed her a pre-signed card. Thanks. She smiled, then began walking toward young Midoriya's group. Toshinori took one last look at young Midoriya before turning away, watching the boy smiling with his friends. How ironic. His insensitive words had been intended to keep the boy safe, because he believed then, and continued to believe yesterday, that villains would be too powerful for him to face as a hero. And yet, those words ultimately resulted in him coming here, fighting monsters like Godzilla, who'd leveled a decent portion of the town in mere minutes. To say Toshinori's words had backfired would be an understatement. But young Midoriya was happy. He was fulfilled. Toshinori wondered whether it was divine punishment for him or recompense to young Midoriya that he find his purpose here, in the exact opposite sort of life Toshinori advised him to join. Maybe both. Either way, Toshinori had much to consider. Good luck, young Midoriya. I wish you well. Izuku walked toward his team's tent, wiping the sweat from his brow. It had been a long night. Fortunately, he and his team were given permission to go and sleep for the rest of the day, something Izuku could not get fast enough. His mind felt like he was in a fog, disconnected from the world around him. As Izuku neared his tent, he turned on his phone and was met with several messages. Ochako, I heard there was an attack last night. What happened? Was it Godzilla? Are you okay? Ochako, Midori, please answer. Or at least mark it read. Ochako, I am on the verge from calling your mother to see if you're all right, so you'd better answer me. In an instant, the fog lifted, replaced by a devastating urgency. Izuku quickly typed in Ochako's number and dialed. Rying. Come on, pick up, Izuku thought, desperate to escape his peril. Finally, it picked up. Midori, about time. Izuku pulled the phone from his ear, then slowly brought it back. Hey, Ochako? What the heck, Midori? I wake up to hear about an attack on Scarus in the night, and when I call to see if my best friend is all right, you don't even bother to pick up your phone. Sorry, Izuku said. After the attack, I spent the whole night helping with the immediate disaster relief. This is the first time I've even checked it. You didn't tell Mom, did you? Ochako sighed. Of course you did. No, I did not call her. Now what happened? How is it over there? Godzilla, and it could be worse, Izuku said. It always could. What about casualties? Any losses? Dozens injured, several dead among civilians, a few dead among the infantry, Izuku said. As for your friends and my team, we're all okay. What about my baby? Is she okay too? Izuku rolled his eyes. Your tank is okay too. Don't roll your eyes at me. Me and that tank have been through a lot together. How did you even know I rolled my eyes? It was in your voice, Midori, she said with a hint of pride. I can tell. Izuku elected to ignore his friend's newfound telepathy and instead tell her the other important news. Ochako, after the attack, Godzilla left Scarus, in the opposite direction from where we wanted. We don't know where he's heading, but it's probably toward the mainland. There was a moment of silence. Understood. Thank you for telling me, Midori. You're welcome, Ochako. Please take care. I will, she said. I may be fearless, but I'm not stupid. Really? You always made it sound like there wasn't a difference. Because there's a line between them, and you took a flying leap over it, Midori. Izuku opened his mouth to object. He closed it. To add insult to injury, Ochako apparently used that same sixth sense from before, because at that very moment she snorted. "Take care. I'll talk to you later." "Goodbye, Ochako. Good luck." Izuku hung up. Talking with Ochako always made him feel a bit lighter. With that finished, Izuku crawled onto his cot and let himself finally drift to sleep. "Sir, one of our SGS detected him at point 05, heading northeast." Admiral Mori walked over to his subordinate and examined his screen. He walked over to a map where they'd drawn Godzilla's previous heading. Mori narrowed his eyes. His new location was a straight line from the heading he'd had when he left Scarus. "Drop another SGS here." Mori pointed at a spot several kilometers further along said line. "If he keeps his present course, I want it waiting." "Yes, sir." Mori's eyes drifted down the map, following Godzilla's current heading. They landed on his destination should his course hold firm. "Please not there. Anywhere but there." Mifune and X booked the earliest train they could out of the city. They left the villain group they'd hired inside the warehouse to guard their device, then hurried to the station. Once they were seated aboard the train, Mifune let out a sigh of relief. They'd done it. Last time he'd left this city, it had been in disgrace. Now, he left in triumph, whether anyone knew it or not. As the train started to move, Mifune looked out the window, taking one last look at the Tokyo Tower before it disappeared from view. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 4. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author GFan97 on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.